There is something uniquely charming about bad racing games. Not the kind that are just forgettable, I mean the truly special kind. The games that try, fail, and somehow still leave behind a weird sense of fascination. The kind where every design decision feels just slightly off, like it was made by someone who's seen racing games, but never actually played one. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, and then I play them, review them, and rank them. So last week we had the absolutely horrible GT Racers, and once again we have another budget PS2 game this week, so thank you Worst Racing Games wheel. This is classic British motor racing on the PS2. Released in February of 2006, developed by Data Design Interactive, a studio very infamous for pumping out low-budget titles at a frankly alarming rate. This is one of those games that instantly raises questions the moment you hear about it, because on paper, this one actually doesn't sound terrible. Licensed British cars, a focus on classic vehicles, a few different modes, weather effects, even kind of a tutorial, or at least an explanation. But then you remember who made it. Yes, the same developers behind two of my least favourite games we've covered in this series, Action Girls Racing, and London Taxi Rush Hour, a studio whose reputation, if we're being honest, is built almost entirely on producing some of the most questionable gaming experiences ever put to disc. So the question is, did they finally get one kinda right, or is this just another entry in the Data Design Hall of Shame? Let's find out. Classic British Motor Racing launched on PS2 in 2006, published in Europe by Metro 3D. A couple of years later, it got a Wii release in 2008, which if you know anything about shovelware on the Wii, probably tells you everything you may need to know. This was a time when the PS2 was absolutely flooded with racing games. So for a smaller developer like Data Design Interactive, standing out was, well, kinda difficult to be fair, and their solution, more often than not, wasn't to innovate, it was to just mass produce. They made a lot of games, and most of them were very cheap, most of them were very rushed, and most of them were frankly not very good. But every now and then you'd get something that looked like they were at least trying, and I'm happy to say that classic British motor racing feels like one of those attempts. So let's boot it up, and immediately, yeah, this is a Data Design Interactive game. The menus are exactly what you'd expect, simple, flat, and incredibly cheap. There's no flair, no style, no real sense of identity. It's functional, and that's probably about the nicest thing I can possibly say about it. But here's the thing, at least it does function. Everything is laid out clearly enough, you can navigate without confusion, there's no weird design quirks getting in your way, and surprisingly there's kind of a tutorial. It's like a proper explanation of how the game works, what the modes are, and what you're supposed to be doing. And that might sound like the bare minimum, because, like, it kind of is, but for this developer it actually feels like a step up. It gives the impression, at least initially, that maybe a little more effort went into this one. Not a lot, but more than usual. Now if you've played any other Data Design game, you will probably recognise the menu layout because they literally just cut and paste it from game to game and change the background picture. It is quite lazy. In terms of content, the game offers three main modes: single race, championship, and time trials. Single race is exactly what you'd expect. Pick a track, pick a car, go racing. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Championship mode is where most of the structure lies. There are three different tiers, that's bronze, silver, and gold, each consisting of 4 races. Progress through them, earn points, standard stuff really. And then there's the time trials, which is where things actually get a bit strange. Before you can use any of the 13 cars in the game, you have to complete a time trial with each one. They call it qualifying, but it doesn't actually determine your starting position in any races, which is kind of weird. It's essentially just a gatekeeping mechanic to stretch the game out. The good news is you don't have to do anything particularly challenging. There's no strict requirement for performance, you just complete a lap and the car is unlocked. And because you can choose any track, just pick the shortest one and breeze through the entire roster in a quick time. It's not a terrible system, it's just a kind of pointless one. Like a lot of things in this game, it feels like an idea that was implemented without really thinking through why it actually exists. Now before we talk about the actual racing, if you're a fan of retro games, racing games, or in this case, kind of bad racing games, if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell to stay up to date with my future uploads. And if you'd like to support this series and channel any further, and want access to some cool goodies like early access to videos and your name in the credits of uploads, then please consider checking out my Patreon using the link in the description below. Anyway, let's get into the actual racing, because really this is where things start to fall apart. The first thing you'll notice is the handling, and honestly it's very weird. All the cars feel very similar, which isn't ideal in a game that's supposedly celebrating classic British vehicles. You'd expect maybe some variation from the Mini to the Austin Healey, different weights, different handling characteristics, something at least to make each car feel unique, but instead everything just feels kind of floaty, like the cars aren't properly connected to the road. There's a lack of weight, a lack of responsiveness, and it makes precise control very difficult, especially when you're trying to take corners at speed. And that's before you factor in the performance issues, because yes, the frame rate does drop. Not constantly, but it's definitely enough to be noticeable, especially when multiple cars are on screen and colliding with each other. And when your handling already feels loose and imprecise, those dips make things even harder to manage. It creates this strange disconnect where you're never quite confident in what the car is going to do. Then we have the AI, and if you've played literally any data design interactive game before, you already know what to expect here. They are not good. In fact, calling them AI might be giving them too much credit. They're slow, they're inconsistent, and most importantly, as per usual, they're incredibly stupid. They'll crash into walls for no reason, they'll collide with each other or you constantly. Sometimes they'll just veer off as if they've completely forgotten what a racing line even is. And the best part, it doesn't really matter what difficulty you choose because they're just bad across the board, which completely kills any sense of challenge. You're not racing against competent opponents, you're basically just navigating around a bunch of moving obstacles, and once you're past them, just setting faster lap times. And even those obstacles aren't particularly threatening. Visually, the game is, well, a mixed bag. Let's start with the positives. The cars themselves are licensed, featuring brands like MG, Austin, and Triumph, and that's actually a decent touch and it gives the game a bit of authenticity. Model-wise, they're fine, I guess. They're not really great. They're not the worst I've ever seen, they're just kind of passable, which again is better than what I expected from this developer. But then you look at the environments and that's where things start to feel even worse. There are 4 countryside tracks and they all look basically the same. Dull colours, minimal detail, very little variation. It's the kind of environment where nothing really stands out, and after a couple of races or even laps, everything just blends together. It's not offensive, just really boring. However, the London tracks were a bit of a surprise. There are 2 city-based circuits and they actually look okay. Still not great, but noticeably better than the countryside tracks. Which is particularly ironic when you remember that this is the same devs that made London Taxi Rush Hour, and somehow they've managed to depict London better here in 2 small tracks than in an entire game dedicated to London. It's not saying much, but it's something. Interestingly, the game also includes weather effects, specifically rain and lightning. Rain looks okay, it adds a bit of atmosphere even if it doesn't actually affect the handling whatsoever, which, feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. But then there's the lightning, and yeah, I'm just going to give a quick warning about flashing lights, so if you want to skip that part, go to the time shown on screen now. So yeah, instead of subtle flashes in the distance, you get these rapid full-screen white flashes that completely overpower the visual. It's jarring, it's distracting, and if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, it could genuinely be a massive problem. It's one of those features that probably sounded good in theory, but wasn't executed well at all. So moving on to the sound design, the game features 3 licensed tracks from an 80s band called Extraordinary Through the Bullet, which is a band I've never heard of before playing this game, and to be honest I don't think many people have because, having done some research, I couldn't really find very much. But the songs themselves are fine, I guess. They're perfectly listenable. The problem is there's just 3 of them, so after a few races you really start to notice the repetition. And after a few more, it becomes impossible to ignore. There's just not enough variety to keep things interesting. As for the engine and car sounds, they're about as generic as you'd expect. There's no real character or distinctiveness, just standard placeholder sounding audio. Again, not the worst we've ever heard, it's just incredibly uninspired. And that kind of sums up the entire experience. Nothing here is completely broken, nothing is outrageously offensive, but almost everything about it feels underdeveloped. It's like a game that was built to meet the bare minimum requirements of being a racing game, and then shipped, which does kind of sum up data design perfectly. There are hints of effort, a kind of tutorial, licensed cars, some okay visuals in certain parts of the game, but none of it comes together in any kind of a meaningful way. And of course, because of that, unsurprisingly, the critical reception to this game was not good. Across all versions, the game reviewed poorly. One of the more notable reviews that I came across was from GamesRadar, which gave the PS2 version a 1 out of 5. And honestly, that feels about right. Their summary of pros and cons is particularly telling, highlighting just how little this game does to stand out in an already crowded genre. And as for the sales figures, well, there aren't really any to go off of, and that usually tells its own story. This isn't a game that made a big impact, it wasn't a hidden gem, it was just there for a very brief moment, and then it wasn't. So now the time has come to rank classic British motor racing on our worst racing games tier list. Now, in all fairness, this is probably the best data design interactive game that I've played in this series, but saying that is like saying I have a favourite Lego brick to stand on barefoot in the night. The game is not good, do not get me wrong. It's nice to see some of these older licensed cars, but outside of that, there's not really anything else that I can say positive about this game. So instead of joining all the other data design games down in pure evil, I think classic British motor racing belongs in hot garbage. It is slightly better than the other games that these guys have pumped out, but it is still absolutely terrible, but at least it does have some redemption. So is it worth playing at all? Probably not. Even by the standards of budget PS2 racing games, it doesn't really offer much of a reason to come back. Inconsistent handling, terrible AI, and just very boring presentation. Well, there are bad racing games, and then there are these kinds of racing games. The ones you don't hear about, or the ones that never had a chance of competing with some of the bigger names. The ones that even quietly appeared on shop shelves, sat there for a few months, and then vanished into obscurity. And every now and then you come across one and start to wonder, how and why did this actually get released? Because the PS2 era was packed with racing games. You had the heavy hitters, the arcade classics, the weirder experimental stuff. There really was something for everyone. Even budget titles could surprise you. Sometimes they lacked polish, yeah, but they'd make up for it with charm or speed or just some kind of identity. But then you get games that feel like they skipped that step entirely. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, then I play them, review them, and rank them. Last week we had the surprisingly entertaining Crash and Burn, and the wheel this week has blessed us with GT Racers. A game that looks like a racing game, sounds like a racing game, but once you actually sit down and play said racing game, you realise very quickly that something is just off. Released in 2004, developed by Aqua Pacific, who, and I say this with absolutely no disrespect, but also complete honesty, are best known for making a couple of licensed Top Trumps games on the PS2, which already kind of tells you everything you need to know. And published by Oxygen Interactive, which is a company that was very much in the business of pumping out low-budget titles during the PS2 era. And just to make things even weirder, this game also got a Game Boy Advance release in 2006. 2 years later, genuinely who was asking for more of this game? Now, if this series has taught me one thing, it's to always try and go into these budget racers with an open mind. The PS2 era was full of hidden gems after all, and most of them in the lower price brackets. Not everything had to be Gran Turismo to be enjoyable. Sometimes you get something scrappy but fun, but GT Racers is not one of those games. This is the kind of thing that feels like it exists purely to fill shelf space. The kind of thing you'd find in a bargain bin for maybe £4.99, if they were overcharging, and even then you'd hesitate slightly before you pick it up. So first things first, let's start with the menus, because surprisingly this is one of the more competent parts of the game. They're not good, let's be very clear about that, but at least they're serviceable. Everything is fairly clean, it's relatively easy to navigate, and weirdly it's kinda sleek in a very early 2000s budget software kind of way. It's hard to explain, but there's almost this illusion of quality here. Like if you just looked at screenshots of the menus, you might think, this might be a halfway decent racing game. But of course that illusion disappears very quickly the moment you actually start playing. Still, credit where it's due, we've seen far worse menu systems in PS2 budget titles, even in this series. At the very least, GT Racers doesn't actively frustrate you before you even get into a race, and that's about as much praise as I can give this game as a whole, so let's get on to the bad. So in terms of content, things are of course incredibly bare bones. You've got two modes, and that is Quick Race and Championship. That's it, guys, that's literally it. No time trials, no multiplayer modes, no unlock systems, no meaningful progression, just those two options. And even the Championship mode isn't really much of a championship. It's essentially one long sequence of races across all available tracks. There are 5 tracks in total, yes, 5, and each one has a nighttime variant. Now you might think that doubles the content, right? Well, day and night versions? Well, not really, because the night versions are barely darker anyway. It's like someone just nudged the brightness slider down by about 5% and went, fuck it, that'll do. There's no real atmosphere, no meaningful difference in visibility, no added challenge, they just exist to pad out the track list and drag the game out a little bit longer. So realistically, you're dealing with 5 tracks, and you'll be seeing them over and over and over again. Lucky you. Now we get to the most important part of any racing game, the actual gameplay, and this is where GT Racers completely falls apart. The handling is honestly kind of fascinating in how bad and rough it really is. It somehow manages to feel both overly sensitive and completely unresponsive at the exact same time. You'll turn slightly and the car will jerk violently like you've yanked the wheel across the entire goddamn dashboard, but then other times you'll try to correct your line and it just doesn't really respond at all. There's just no consistency, no predictability, it just feels like the game is making decisions on a whim, independently of your actual inputs, and because of that you never really feel in control of the car. You're not driving, you're just kind of reacting to whatever the game decides it wants to do next. Which is just no way to play at all. I mean, maybe it's novel for like 5 minutes, but beyond that, what's the point? So whilst GT Racers has some very strange design decisions, there is one that's definitely the contender for the worst, or weirdest. You are permanently stuck in bumper cam. No third person view, no chase cam, nothing. The only time the game actually switches perspective is when you look behind you, or when you crash and it just randomly goes into third person. And that's it. I feel like this raises so many questions, like why? Why would you lock the player into a bumper cam in a game where the handling is already terrible, the track design isn't great, and spatial awareness is actually important? It makes the game harder to play, and not in a challenging or rewarding way, but in a frustrating, disorienting way. And then, this is the part that really gets me, the game has 3 different buttons to look behind you, triangle and the 2 triggers. 3. Why do you need 3 separate buttons for the same function, when you don't even have 1 button to change the perspective? It's such a bizarre allocation of controls that it almost feels like a mistake. Like something went wrong in the development process and they just never bothered to fix it. Or maybe, and this is a genuine theory, they just didn't include a third person camera because the car models look so bad that they didn't want you to see them. Which honestly wouldn't surprise me. Maybe that's why the AI is so bad and you overtake them so quickly, so you don't actually have to look at them. Now, speaking of car models, this is not a good looking game. Now, to be fair, I've definitely seen worse on the PS2, especially in the budget category, but that's not really a compliment. That's just saying it's not at the absolute bottom of the barrel. The cars themselves are unlicensed, and whilst there's nothing wrong with that, they are, frankly, very ugly. They lack detail, they lack personality, and since you're stuck in bumper cam, you barely even see them anyway, which makes their existence feel almost completely and utterly pointless. The environments are equally bland, there's no real identity to any of the tracks even though they are set in real-world locations like London and Tokyo. They all kind of blend together into this generic low-detail landscape that occasionally has a landmark like the London Eye. And then there's the pop-in. On certain tracks, especially the London track, it's really noticeable. Objects just appear out of nowhere as you're driving, which is incredibly distracting and further adds to the overall lack of polish. There's just zero visual cohesion, there's no sense of place and no atmosphere. It feels like a collection of unfinished assets stitched together into something that vaguely resembles a racing game. Like, And whilst we're at it, the audio isn't exactly much better. As far as I can tell, there are basically 2 music tracks in the entire game, and that's one for the menus and one for the races. And neither of them are particularly memorable or any good. They're just kinda there, looping endlessly and doing the bare minimum to fill the silence. Honestly, you're probably better off just turning the music off and putting your own playlist on. The engine sounds are fine, I guess, completely generic, but at least functional. The problem is that none of the cars have distinct audio profiles, so every vehicle sounds exactly the same. Which again reinforces this feeling that nothing in the game really matters. Your car choice doesn't matter, the tracks don't matter. The experience is just this flat, incredibly repetitive loop. So the game features 9 cars in total, and I genuinely cannot stress enough how little that bit of information matters. They all feel the exact same to drive. There is no meaningful difference in handling, speed, or performance that you can actually feel during the gameplay, and since you can't even see the car that you're driving most of the time, it becomes even more irrelevant. It's like the game is presenting you with choices that don't actually exist. Pick your car. Like, okay, but why? What difference does it actually make? And the answer to that, viewers, is none. So you put all that together, and what you end up with is a game that feels incredibly hollow. There is no depth, no variety, and no sense of progression or reward. It's just drive poorly handled cars, on bland tracks, with minimal content, and questionable design decisions, over and over again. And because of that, it becomes boring very quickly. And not even in an entertainingly bad way, it's just very dull. Now, unsurprisingly, GT Racers doesn't even have a Metacritic score, which says a lot in itself. There is, however, a single user review floating around that gives it a 1 out of 10. And honestly, it pretty much sums everything up perfectly, and I will read it to you now. The cars are all unlicensed and ugly, the tracks are bland, plus there are only 5 of them. And the physics are incredibly wonky. For some reason, this game features 3 different buttons for reverse view, but none for changing the camera. But really, the only 2 buttons you need will be on the console for turning it off and ejecting the disc. Only really has use for game collectors. So yeah, I don't think I could put it any better than that. Okay, so now the time has come to rank GT Racers on our worst racing games tier list. Now obviously I don't think this is the absolute bottom of the barrel of this series, but it's definitely up there with some of the worst that we've played. So really there's no other place for this game than to go into pure evil. It really is just a bad game, there's not really any redeeming features here, it's not fun, there's no entertainment value from how bad it is, even the crashes are just boring, there's just nothing going on here. GT Racers is one of those games that's hard to recommend to pretty much anyone, even if you're a fan of retro racing games, even if you enjoy budget titles, or if you're even looking for something obscure, because there's nothing here to latch onto. There's no hidden charm, no unique hook, not even a so bad it's good factor, it's just bad. The kind of game that feels unfinished, poorly thought out and completely lacking an identity. In the early 2000s, licensed games were a dime a dozen. Whilst a few were genuinely very good, a lot of these games were either painfully average and forgotten about, or just painfully bad, and there didn't really seem to be an in-between. So what happens when you take a forgotten and kind of panned early 2000s cartoon and the anti-grav racing genre and throw it in a blender? Well, you get today's game. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, then I play them, review them, and rank them. So last week we had the frankly downright terrible White Van Racer for the PS2, a Phoenix Games classic, if you will. So this week the Worst Racing Games wheel has blessed upon us probably one of the most cursed names for a game I've ever seen. This is Butt Ugly Martians, Zoom, or Doom. Or if you want to be extra classy, you can abbreviate that to Bumzod. Yep, that's what we're going to be calling it, Bumzod. So before we dive into the actual game, we first have to understand what the Butt Ugly Martians actually are. So this was a very short-lived animated TV show from the early 2000s that ran between February 2001 and February 2003. It aired here in the UK on CITV and in the US on Nickelodeon. So I'll just read you the actual premise from the Butt Ugly Martians wiki page because I don't think I can sum it up any better anyway. The plot of the series begins when the Butt Ugly Martians, or BUM, are forced to invade planets for the evil Emperor Bog. When they are sent to Earth, they become addicted to American culture. Deciding not to hurt Earth, they simply pretend to be occupying the planet for Bog. They are shown around by their Earthling friends, Mike, Cedric, and Angela. The Butt Ugly Martians continue to hang out on Earth as long as Emperor Bog never finds out. And that's the show, apparently. With that premise, it both sounds fantastic and absolutely terrible at the same time, so fair play, guys. Anyway, let's get to the actual game. Okay, so this game came out in December 2002 here in Europe and July 2003 in the US, and that was on the PlayStation 2, which is the version we're looking at today. There was, however, a GameCube port, but weirdly that only released in Europe back in May 2003, so not quite sure what was going on there. Anyway, this was developed by Runecraft, who, fun fact, were briefly owned by the BBC around the same time this game came out. And if you want to know what we're dealing with here, let's just go through some of the games they've worked on previously. So we've got some absolute classics like Barbie Explorer, Jim Henson's The Hoobs, Westlife Fan-O-Mania, and Arthur Ready to Race. So, yeah, this was very much a licensed game factory situation. Anyway, this was published by Vivendi Universal Games, which at the time was putting out all kinds of stuff, some good, like Simpsons Hit and Run, and some, well, like this. Now, I never played this as a kid, I never watched the show as a kid, so this definitely is not going to be nostalgia talking. I went in completely blind, and tried to figure out if this is actually any good, or if this is exactly what it sounds like. So, when you first boot up the game, you are greeted with something that genuinely caught me off guard. A language selection screen. I wasn't caught off guard by the fact I had to choose my language. It's just the screen itself. It's literally one of the Martians standing there, holding a flag of the language you want to speak. And I'm not gonna lie, I did kind of laugh. It's quite clever, it's charming, in its own weird Martian kind of way. It really doesn't take much to impress me. Anyway, from there you're taken to the main menu, which is displayed on this big golden monitor. It's clearly trying to look futuristic, but it also kind of looks like something you'd see in a low-budget sci-fi show, which I guess, to be fair, is exactly what this game is based on. So you've got your usual options like single player and multiplayer, and then there's assist mode, which is basically just single player, but with steering assist turned on. Which is funny, because the game is actually already easy, but we'll get to that. Then you move on to the character selection, and this is where things get a bit questionable. You've got characters like Do Wah Diddy. What? I'm sorry, there's only one Diddy that I recognize. Yeah, you thought that was going somewhere else, didn't you? Anyway, there's also some random human in this game called Stoat Muldoon. I don't even know anymore, guys. Anyway, at that point, you just gotta stop asking questions, like, sure, why not, let's just roll with it. So, in terms of single-player content, the game actually looks like it has quite a lot going on. I'll read you what we got. There's the Conqueror's Cup, Practice Mode, Quick Race, Time Attack, Speed Challenge, and Battle Challenge. Now, on paper, that seems like a really decent variety, but in reality, most of these modes are basically the same thing. So let's break it down. The main one, well, the one you'll spend most of your time in, is the Conqueror's Cup. This is your standard championship mode. There are 3 cups, one with 5 races, one with 7, and one with 9. Each one increases the difficulty slightly, mostly through AI behaviour, and if you beat all 3, you unlock a bonus cup where you race through all 9 tracks again, but mirrored, which is a nice little extra, I guess. Not exactly groundbreaking, but at least it is something. And then you've got Practice Mode and Quick Race, which are exactly what they sound like. Time Attack is there for setting lap times if that's what you're into. And then you've got Speed Challenge and Battle Challenge. Now, these sound interesting. Speed Challenge is basically a shorter version of the Cup. 5 races, each one increasing in difficulty. That's it. Then there's Battle Challenge, which is one-on-one races against other characters. But here's the thing, they don't really add anything meaningful, it's just more of the same racing with slightly different labels. So yeah, technically there's variety, but in practice it all kind of blends together. So this is a futuristic racing game. You're driving hovercrafts basically around these winding sci-fi tracks. And clearly the developers were aiming for something in the same general space as games like Wipeout. But here's the difference, in Wipeout, surviving the race is like half the challenge, but in Bumzod you can basically win by accident. I'm not exaggerating, the game is incredibly forgiving. Your hovercraft is immune to physical damage when scraping walls, which means you can just bounce around the track with almost no consequences. There's no real penalty for sloppy driving. You don't need precision, and you don't even really need skill. You can just hold the accelerator, sort of steer in the general direction of the track, and still come out on top. It genuinely feels like the game is designed so that anyone can win, no matter what. Now, to be fair, you're not completely invincible. There are obstacles on the track, and there are weapon pickups. These can stun your vehicle, spin you out, or slow you down for a few seconds. But even then, unless you're on like the final difficulty, it barely matters, because after a short moment, you're back in control and often still in the same position anyway. And then there are the power-ups. There are actually quite a few of them, and they have different effects, but a lot of them feel kind of pointless. The only one that really matters is the speed boost, and even that you don't actually need. But in all fairness, the power-up system is at least kind of interesting, because you go through a pickup at random, and you'll get the first level of that pickup, so you can upgrade it twice by driving through more pickups. So on paper, there's a layer of strategy as to when you can use them. But basically, if you get the speed boost one, just wait till you picked up 3 and use it at the end. Because the first tier of the speed boost is an auto steer. Kinda like the same vibes as a bullet bill in Mario Kart, but without any of the speed or any of the power behind it. So it will drive you right directly down the middle of the track, and it does not avoid obstacles. So if you use this and there is something in the middle of the track to block you, you will just crash into it and keep crashing into it until the power-up runs out. What an absolutely stupid design that is. Just infuriatingly dumb. But anyway, I digress. Even the power-ups you don't really need. You can win races without ever using them. And for an early 2000s racing game, the AI isn't even super rubber bandy. But if you fall behind, you can catch up. But it does remove any sense of tension, because the game basically is always going to give you another chance. So even on the hardest difficulty, you could probably finish everything this game has to offer in literally a couple of hours, which is not great. So let's talk track design, because this is one area where the game does at least try to do something interesting. The tracks themselves are actually pretty creative. You've got multiple paths going on, environmental hazards, which can be quite annoying, and branching routes. And in theory, this should add some depth. You're supposed to learn the tracks, figure out the best routes, and optimize your racing line. But the problem with that is, when you're already winning every race without having to try, why bother learning the tracks? Because there's no incentive to explore or improve. You're not being challenged in the first place, so why bother? And then there's the collision detection, which is questionable, because of course it is. This is an early 2000s racing game made on a budget. I feel like I say this every week. The collision detection isn't great, guys, okay? It's not the worst we've seen, but it's definitely inconsistent enough to be noticeable.
I'll get my revenge. Your evil butt is about to be
So visually, this game is kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you've got some CGI cutscenes, and honestly, they're okay. In fact, if anything, the CGI cutscenes in this game look better than the actual show, which I guess isn't exactly a high bar because... ooh, yikes. But once you get into the actual gameplay, it's a different story. The graphics aren't exactly butt ugly, see what I did there, but they're definitely below what the PS2 was capable of. The environments have some colour and some variety, and some of the track designs are visually interesting, but the vehicles themselves, they are boring as anything, guys. They are so dull. They don't have that sleek, futuristic look that you'd expect from this type of game. And the special effects are very basic. There's simple explosions and basic particle effects and some flames and steam, but nothing that really stands out, to be honest. It all feels a bit low budget. But that said, the frame rate is actually pretty solid, and the sense of speed is decent enough. So it's not like a technical disaster, it's just very underwhelming. Now, whilst the game might not be the most interesting in terms of its visuals, the sound and music is where the game actually redeems itself just a little bit. Because the soundtrack is surprisingly good. It's full of techno and dance-sounding tracks that feel like they belong to a much higher budget anti-grav racing game. It's energetic, it fits the gameplay, and it genuinely stands out as one of the better parts of the experience. The sound effects, on the other hand, not so much. They are pretty generic and they don't have much impact to the game. And then you've got the voice acting, which uses the same actors from the TV show, and honestly, it's not that bad. In fact, it's surprisingly decent. The opening cutscene actually got a couple of laughs out of me, but in-game, the voice lines are very limited, and they repeat a lot. Which I think is pretty standard for a lot of these animated tie-in video games. They have the voice actors, but they don't actually use them very much.
I'll get my revenge. Your evil butt is about to be very funny, Martians.
So, how was the game received in terms of critical response? Well, as I'm sure you can probably guess, it wasn't received very well. The PS2 version currently holds a 41 out of 100 on Metacritic, which is quite rough. The GameCube version doesn't even have any reviews to get a score, which probably tells you everything you need to know. As for sales, it reportedly sold around about 20,000 copies, which is extremely low, even for a licensed title like this. Those stats are from VG charts. So now the time has come to rank Bumzod in our worst racing games tier list. Now, this is somehow not one of the worst games I've played in this series. It's definitely rough, very rough, but I think for me, this game will be going into the hot garbage category. This was a game that was made quickly with a limited budget to capitalise on a TV show that literally no one remembers. There are a few bright spots to it, a decent soundtrack, some okay cutscenes, and some fairly creative track design, but it's just held back by one major issue. It's just boring. There's no challenge or sense of progression or reason to improve. And without that, a racing game's kind of pointless. So unless you're a die-hard fan of the show, or you're just curious about the obscure games that we cover on this channel, there's really no reason to go out of your way to play this whatsoever. But hey, at least it gave us one of the most ridiculous game titles of all time, and honestly I think that might be this game's greatest achievement. The Nintendo DS had a lot of racing games. Some of them were genuinely quite good, others were interesting experiments that tried to push the handheld hardware in some weird directions. And then there were ones that existed purely because someone had a license and a deadline. Today we are looking at a game that sits somewhere right in the middle of that mess. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, and then I play them, review them, and rank them. So last week we had the surprisingly good Scars for the PS1, so we've kind of moved back in a sloppier direction to Ford Racing 3. It's a budget racing game handheld port based on a budget racing series running on a handheld that was still figuring out how to handle full 3D races. On paper, that combination doesn't exactly inspire confidence, but the funny thing about Ford Racing 3 is that it comes from the same studio responsible for what might genuinely be one of the worst racing games on the DS, Burnout Legends. Yes, that's Burnout Legends, one of the very first games I covered in this series, and probably to this day, still one of the worst games I've covered in this series, nearly a year later. Which means the real question here isn't whether Ford Racing 3 is good, it's more a question of whether the developers managed to redeem themselves even just slightly after the absolute show that was the Burnout conversion. So my name is Kledge and we are going to dive into the world of Ford Racing 3. So before we talk about the DS version specifically, it's worth quickly talking about the Ford Racing series itself, because this wasn't exactly a blockbuster franchise. The Ford Racing games were mid-2000s licensed racing titles built entirely around one idea: you drive Ford cars. That's literally it, that's the hook. No massive open world, no deep sim systems, no dramatic story mode, just a lineup of Ford vehicles spanning several decades, racing around some competently designed fictional tracks. The third game in the series originally released on PC, PS2 and Xbox in 2004, and those versions were fairly typical arcade races for the time. Lots of Ford vehicles, a bunch of tracks, and a progression system based around unlocking cars and events. Then in 2005 the game got this handheld port for the DS. And that's where things start getting interesting, because porting racing games to early DS hardware was, well, tricky, as we know from Burnout Legends and Need for Speed ports. The system could handle 3D environments, but obviously it was nowhere near as powerful as home consoles of the time. Developers had to make compromises everywhere, with things like track complexity, vehicle models, physics calculations, and AI behaviour. Some studios handled that challenge really well. I mean, look at Ridge Racer on the DS, that's pretty cool. Others, not so much, and Visual Impact, which is the studio behind this version, had already proven that they definitely struggled with that balance. Just weeks before this game released, Burnout Legends, which if you ever played it, you'll know is borderline unplayable, so my expectations for this were, well, incredibly, extremely, very low. So booting up Ford Racing, the first thing that stands out is how normal everything kind of feels. There's no dramatic intro, no big presentation flourishes, just some menus, some modes, and a straightforward racing setup. Which low-key kind of works in the game's favour, because one of the biggest problems with many DS racers at the time was definitely ambition outpacing the hardware. Devs would try to replicate the full console experience, and the system would just crash and burn because it couldn't handle it. Ford Racing 3 avoids that trap just by keeping things simple. This is a very traditional arcade racing game. You pick a car, you race on a track, and you try to beat other cars to the finish line. And for the main mode, that's the entire premise. There's no damage modeling, no deep tuning system or customization. There's no attempt, well, certainly no attempt at hardcore simulation physics. It's just some racing. And while that might sound kind of boring, it actually helps the game feel focused in a way a lot of DS racers didn't. So let's talk about the car lineup. Since this is a Ford licensed game, of course the car list is entirely made up, you guessed it, of Ford vehicles. That means you get a mix of classic American muscle cars, some more modern sports cars, and some slightly weirder entries thrown in for variety. Cars like the Mustang, the Focus, the Thunderbird are all here, alongside trucks and other heavier vehicles. The roster isn't exactly massive compared to console racing games, but it's still a respectable lineup. The interesting part is how the game handles balance. Cars are divided into classes, which prevents something like a high-performance sports car from completely dominating a race against slower vehicles. So if you're racing trucks, everyone's using a kind of truck. If you're racing sports cars, everyone's in something at least roughly comparable. It's a simple system, but it works well enough for a game like this. Where things get slightly less interesting is the presentation of those vehicles. The car models themselves are fine. You can clearly tell what each car is supposed to be, but they lack the polish you'd expect from, well, a higher budget racing game. There's no fancy lighting or reflective surfaces, and the textures are very basic. To be honest, they look a bit dreary. It's not ugly, but it definitely screams budget title. Anyway, let's talk some more about the graphics of this game. So in terms of visuals, Ford Racing 3 is actually quite surprising, because it runs surprisingly well. The game targets a smooth frame rate and generally sticks to it, which is something that couldn't be said for a lot of other DS racers at the time. And more importantly, it actually manages to convey a decent sense of speed. This is something that Burnout Legends completely fail at, but here it works. The environments move past you quickly enough that racing feels fast, even if the graphics themselves are, well, relatively simple. The track environments are fairly varied in terms of layout, but aesthetically they're a bit bland. Forests, deserts, lakeside tracks, the usual racing game settings. The layouts themselves are actually pretty solid. There are some nice corners, elevation changes, and the occasional shortcut here and there. But visually, everything just feels a little bit flat. The colour palette in particular feels quite muted. At times it genuinely looks like someone applied the Zack Snyder colour grading preset to the entire game. Just lots of dull tones. It gets the job done, sure, but it's not exactly exciting to look at. And there are also some slightly awkward animation moments. Cars look a bit strange when they go airborne, and the physics during jumps feel especially weird. Vehicles float in a way that doesn't quite make sense, and then slam back onto the track like the game suddenly remembered about gravity. And if you drive into water, the car just kind of dives under the texture. It looks a bit funny, to be honest. Now we get to the part that makes or breaks any racing game, the handling. And Ford Racing 3 is inconsistent, to say the least. Different cars handle very differently from each other, which on paper obviously makes sense and is a good thing. A sports car should feel more agile than a heavy truck, and the game does reflect that. The problem is that the underlying physics system isn't really great. Steering can feel stiff and sometimes unpredictable, some cars corner nicely while others feel like they are sliding around on ice. And whenever airtime enters the equation, well, things start to feel especially awkward. Jumps don't feel satisfying at all, the physics during those moments look and feel off, like the game wasn't really designed with vertical movement in mind. But despite all of that, the handling isn't completely broken. You can adapt to it after a few races. Once you understand how each car behaves, it does become manageable. It's just not particularly refined. Now in terms of gameplay variety, Ford Racing 3 actually includes a decent amount of content for a handheld racing game. The main mode is the Championship mode, which consists of several racing classes and tournaments. This is where you'll probably spend most of your time. As you progress through the Championship mode, you will unlock additional tracks, which gradually expands the available content. But if you want to get new vehicles, this is where things kind of get annoying. Because there's also a challenge mode, which mixes things up with a variety of different event types, but nearly every vehicle in the game is locked behind it. Some of these are fairly standard, like time trials or elimination races, but others are a bit more questionable. For some reason, Ford Racing 3 is absolutely obsessed with drafting. Drafting, for anyone unfamiliar, is when you drive closely behind another car to reduce air resistance and gain a speed boost. In small amounts, it's a cool mechanic, but in the challenge mode of Ford Racing 3, it shows up way too much. There are entire challenges built around drafting vehicles, and the concept appears in multiple game modes. The problem is that the way it's implemented with the AI can be quite frustrating, because most of the time in these drafting challenges you still have to race an opponent and draft another car, and sometimes the car you need to draft is way slower than you are, which means you have to awkwardly slow down just to stay behind them long enough to trigger the mechanic. And then in doing so, obviously you lose the position that you had. And then occasionally, the opposite happens. There's one challenge where, for me at least, the final car you need to draft drives off so quickly that catching up to it feels basically impossible. And then there's the relay race mode, where passing the baton to your teammate requires, well, take a guess, drafting them. Which means you're constantly trying to line up perfectly behind AI cars that don't always behave predictably. It's a neat idea that wouldn't feel so problematic if the AI just worked a little bit better. So yeah, more about that AI, because the AI in this game is kind of weird. Sometimes it's completely brain dead, and other times it's surprisingly competent and moving to defend from me in a way that I'd expect from modern racing games. The biggest issue really is the rubber banding system, because if you're in first place, the AI cars will obviously stick very close behind you, even if you think you've built a massive lead. Other than the occasional moments of insane defense, they're not particularly aggressive drivers, so for the most part passing them isn't really difficult. But once you're ahead, of course they somehow manage to stay right up your ass regardless of how fast you're going. It's the classic racing game trick where the AI cheats ever so slightly to keep races competitive. Just the thing is, in some games it's less noticeable, and here it's, well, pretty noticeable. But now we need to talk about what might be the single biggest problem in the entire game: the collision detection. Collisions with the environment are mostly fine. If you slam into a wall, your car slows down, obviously that's normal, but collisions with other racers are an absolute mess. If you lightly tap the back of another car while you are both moving at speed, your car can grind to a near halt while the other vehicle gets launched forward like it's Vin Diesel activating his nitrous. It's just kind of ridiculous. Side-by-side racing is arguably worse. Even if it looks like your car isn't touching the other vehicle, the game might just register a collision anyway for the fun of it. And when that happens, one of two things usually occur. Either you get slowed down dramatically, like normal, or your car suddenly gets shoved sideways into a wall, which makes close racing incredibly frustrating. But in these games, surely close racing and competition is what's supposed to make it fun. Ford Racing 3 actively discourages you from driving anywhere near your opponents, and that to me is a very big problem. And I remember Burnout Legends had some absolutely horrendous collision detection as well, and it was worse in that game because the whole game was centered around crashing. Now, at least in terms of the audio side, the game is fine. The music is fairly bland, but it's serviceable. It's the kind of generic mid-2000s racing soundtrack that fills the background without really standing out. You probably won't remember any of it once you've stopped playing, because I don't. Engine sounds are decent, though they're not as varied as you might expect for a game built around so many different Ford vehicles. Still, considering this is a budget DS game, it does the job fairly well. Now, in terms of critical response to Ford Racing 3 at the time, reviews were very mixed. There weren't any really positive reviews, but there were some average ones and then some fairly low ones. But anyway, the game currently holds a Metascore of 49 out of 100 on Metacritic, which I guess is kind of fair. Maybe I'd put it a bit higher, but it's still not a very good game. Now, in terms of user score for the game, the DS version specifically has one user review, giving it a 0 out of 10. So, shout out to this person, I guess, fair play. Now, in terms of sales figures, the game wasn't exactly a record breaker, but in terms of budget level games, I think it actually sold kinda well, having estimated to have sold about 100,000 units, with the vast majority of those being in America. These stats are from VG Charts. Anyway, so now the time has come to rank Ford Racing 3 for the DS on our worst racing games tier list. This is miles ahead of Burnout Legends by the same company, but it's still not a particularly good game. There's decent gameplay variety, there's a nice lineup of cars, some decent track layouts, but the AI and especially the collision detection do pull it down by a significant margin. So for me, this game is going to join quite a few others in the rubbish tier. And it's going to sit quite far down in the rubbish tier alongside games like Noble Racing and Ants on the PS2. It's not a game that I would go out of my way to recommend to anyone, but if you did want to play Ford Racing 3, just play a home console version instead. But it's also not the disaster you might expect from a budget licensed racer on early DS hardware. And compared to some other racers that hit the system around the same time, it definitely could have been much worse. I've played some bad racing games in my time, and I've also played some pretty forgotten ones. But never before have I seen a game that's such a mix of those two things. A game so obscure that finding actual info about it feels harder than winning a Formula 1 World Championship. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, then I play them, review them, and rank them. Last week we played the very strange and kinda not good Hummer Badlands for the PS2, and this week the wheel has finally blessed us with a different platform, and that is the original PlayStation. We are playing a game called Formula GP. This was released in September of 2003, which is, quite late into the PS1's lifespan. By this point, the PS2 was dominating, the Xbox was a thing, the GameCube was out, and proper F1 games had become, significantly more advanced. And yet somehow, this happened. So this game was developed by a company called Kung Fu, and published by Midas Interactive. Oh boy, we're in for a fun one. So Kung Fu were known for developing just a few budget racing games such as Truck Racing, All-Star Racing, and Super Bike Masters, just to name a couple of them. Now, if you've seen this series before, you are probably familiar with Midas Interactive. They were known for publishing a lot of budget, sloppy games, such as Rascal Racers, which we looked at a couple of months back. So yeah, Formula GP is exactly the kind of PS1 budget game you'd expect to find buried in a supermarket bargain bin between a WWE DVD and some dodgy looking third-party memory card. And honestly, that kind of makes it interesting, because games like this are a forgotten part of gaming history. Not every PS1 game could be a smash hit. Some of these games were just kind of products, I guess, cheap and quick and disposable. Formula GP feels like one of those games. But surprisingly, it's not completely terrible, which honestly might be the weirdest part about it. Now let's take a look at the menu design first off, because that genuinely is completely terrible. Right away, it just gives you one of the most lifeless first impressions I've ever seen from a video game menu. It's incredible, and it's not incredible because it's stylish or polished or memorable, it's because it genuinely looks unfinished. It's a mostly black background, a logo for the game that looks like it was made in Microsoft Paint by a 3-year-old, and a random image of an unlicensed Formula-style car. and you get two magnificent options, start and options. That's basically it. There's no flashy intro or music or atmosphere or any attempt whatsoever to make this feel like an exciting game. It honestly, genuinely looks like a placeholder menu that somebody forgot to replace before the game shipped. And weirdly enough, I guess it's part of the charm, maybe, because Formula GP has absolutely no interest in pretending to be bigger than it is, because this game certainly wasn't trying to compete with the actual licensed F1 games. It was just trying to exist, and technically it does succeed at existing at least. Now this is my favourite part, let's talk about the game modes, or should I say, the game mode. Because Formula GP contains exactly one thing to do. Single race, guys, that's it. No championship, no season mode, no career progression, no multiplayer, no unlockables, no time trials. I could keep going here, no challenge events, just race. You pick a car, you pick a track, and you drive. Honestly, the simplicity almost feels aggressive. Most budget games at least try to create the illusion of content, like a fake progression system or a few meaningless unlockables. But Formula GP just doesn't even bother. It just strips the entire F1 experience down to its absolute skeleton and then jumps up and down on that skeleton until it turns to dust. And in a weird way, it's kind of refreshing. A lot of the games that I've looked at follow the same patterns in this series, and this one just throws it all out the window. I mean, look at modern racing games, they're overloaded with systems, battle passes, online rankings, daily challenges, microtransactions, 55 different menus before you actually get to drive a car. But Formula GP says no to all of that. Here's a car, go drive around, and honestly, fair play guys, respect. So of course, Formula GP did not have the FIA license, so all 8 tracks in this game are completely fictional. So we've got some really generational racetrack names such as Hill Valley and Boulder Raceway. These kind of sound like legally safe versions of real circuits created moments before somebody was going to get sued. Anyway, the tracks themselves, surprisingly, aren't terrible. I mean, visually, they're very rough. Texturally, they're also very rough. But layout-wise, they're actually, well, functional. And sometimes kind of interesting. There's some focus on long straights, some are tighter and more technical, and there's enough variety that the tracks actually don't completely blur together, which surprised me a lot. And that puts Formula GP above a lot of other terrible racing games that we've looked at. Because one of the easiest ways to ruin a racing game is by making every circuit and environment feel exactly the same. Here you can at least learn the layouts and improve lap times and kind of build a rhythm. There's a decent foundation underneath all the budget presentation. The more you play it, the more you realise that Formula GP isn't broken, it's just of course extremely cheap. Alright, so let's actually talk gameplay, because this part is another thing that kind of caught me off guard. The handling is okay. It's not amazing, it's of course not realistic, but it's playable. The cars feel heavier than I expected, so instead of instantly snapping into corners like an arcade racer, there's actual momentum to deal with. You need to brake a little bit earlier than you might think, you need to line corners up properly, and once you adjust to the strange steering weight, the game is kind of relaxing. There's almost something hypnotic about doing laps in this game. It's not intense enough to be exciting or difficult enough, and it's not terrible enough to be funny. It just exists in this strange middle ground of total mediocrity. It's incredibly basic, but it at least works. Now let's talk about the car variety, because there are 6 cars, but they are basically all the same. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's just the same vehicle with different colours and different liveries, if you could even call them that. There are no performance differences or handling differences whatsoever. I mean, I wasn't expecting balancing depth from a game developed by people who may or may not have existed, so I guess I'll allow it. Alright, so let's circle back around to the visuals. Formula GP is exactly what you'd expect from a late-era budget PS1 racing game. The car models are passable, they're not good, they're not really detailed, but you can at least recognize the fact that they are Formula cars of some kind. The environments, however, oh dear. Everything is muddy, the textures are blurry, the scenery kind of feels unfinished, and the draw distance isn't really good at all. The grass textures resemble green soup, the mud textures resemble dog diarrhea, and the crowd sprites look less like people and more like colourful television static. Combined with a slightly unstable frame rate, the whole game has this permanently shaky feeling, like it's barely holding itself together, and yet somehow it never actually collapses under that pressure, which is quite impressive. There's just something weirdly lonely about the presentation of this game. The tracks feel completely empty, the menus feel abandoned, and the atmosphere is almost liminal. It's like the backrooms of the Formula 1 gaming world, which is a sentence I thought I'd never ever say, but at least it does give the game a somewhat unique identity. Now let's talk sound design. The soundtrack is incredibly generic electronic music. It's peak royalty-free techno energy. The kind of music you'd expect to hear in the background of a DVD menu from 2002, which is, I guess, at least kind of nostalgic. But surprisingly, different tracks actually have different songs. That's way more effort than I was expecting. Going into the game, I was expecting maybe one track to loop across the menus and races, so that's a win in my books. None of the music is exactly memorable, but at least there is variety. The engine sounds aren't decent enough, they're not really realistic or powerful, but you know it's a car. The tyre sound effects, however, are kind of strange. They just sound off. I don't know how to describe it, so just listen to it. Something about it just doesn't sit right with me, and I can't put my finger on it. Which I think sums up this game pretty much perfectly. It technically works, but there's just something slightly off about it that I can't quite place. Now, before we move on to the reviews and sales figures and whatnot, let's just quickly talk about the AI in the game, because this is of course a racing game, not a time trial game. So the AI is of course not really advanced at all, but they're so easy that you don't really spend any time with them on the tracks. No matter what difficulty you're on, you will just probably fly straight past them. They're at least competent, they have racing lines, they follow them, they don't just crash out randomly like some of the other budget racing games we've looked at. They're just kind of there, really. They don't do anything wrong, they don't do anything interesting. They're just there to make you feel like you're racing something and not just driving through an empty track. But, like, you are driving through an empty track, so they didn't really do a good job. So with that out of the way, what really makes this game interesting to me isn't the gameplay, at all. It's the fact that this thing barely left a footprint. Seriously, try finding any information about this game. There is almost nothing. No meaningful reviews, no sales figures, no developer history, no behind the scenes info. I mean, hell, even the Moby Games site has literally nothing about this game. Formula GP feels less like a real gaming release, and more like I've uncovered a lost artifact of the PS1 world. And I guess that might be kind of common with these low-budget PS1 games. Of course, successful titles get preserved, because people actually care about them. But cheap filler games that are this old, I guess, just disappear. And Formula GP is exactly that. A forgotten game from the dying years of the original PlayStation. Okay, so now the time has come to rank Formula GP on our worst racing games tier list. Now, this is a game that at least functions, but I've struggled to find lots to say about it because you can literally finish the entire game in half an hour. I mean, the runtime of this video is going to be pushing like half the time it takes to complete the entire game. But hey, it's at least functional, and has some very strange charm to it. So I think this game will be joining Badlands in the rubbish tier. It's a repetitive and shallow game that looks rough and barely has any content, but I just can't fully hate it. It functions, the handling works, the tracks are serviceable, there's a variety of music tracks, and the racing is at least functional. And honestly, that puts it above some genuinely terrible racing games from the PS1 and 2 era. What happens when you take a manufacturer known for incredibly large cars and a budget developer? Well, you get the game that we're looking at today. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, and then I play them, review them, and rank them. Last week we had the kind of terrible but ugly Martians, Zoom or Doom, which is still hilarious to say, on the PS2. And this week the wheel has chosen Hummer Badlands, also on the PS2. So this released in April 2006 in America, and that was for the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox, and then here in Europe in July 2006. And weirdly, the Xbox version never actually made it to Europe, which is odd considering that version was arguably the more technically capable one. Anyway, this was developed by Eutechnyx, who you may recognise for games such as 007 Racing, Ford vs Chevy, and Hot Wheels Beat That. A mixed bag, but very much in the licensed budget racing lane, and we've seen quite a lot of their games here on the channel. It was published by Global Star Software, and honestly that publisher name alone should probably set some expectations. This was never meant to be a premium racing experience. This is budget bin territory through and through. Now, to be honest, I'm not overly familiar with Hummer's cars, because if you put a Hummer here where I live in England, it would flatten a small village with how small and narrow our roads are. Now, there is something inherently strange to me about the concept of Hummer racing, because really these vehicles are designed for military use, and were later adapted into oversized civilian cars. They're not exactly built for speed, agility, or certainly competitive racing. Yet here we are. A full racing game built entirely around them. And not just off-road challenges either. Actual circuit-style racing in vehicles that weigh as much as small buildings. That contradiction is really at the heart of Hummer Badlands. It doesn't quite know what it wants to be. Is it an off-road sim light, an arcade racer, a novelty vehicle showcase? The answer is kind of all of them, I guess, but not particularly good at any of them. So upon booting the game up, you're greeted with a very average looking menu. Like, it's fine. You've got a large image of a Hummer, the game's logo slapped front and center, and a vertical list of options on the right hand side. It's clean, readable and functional, but it's not exactly groundbreaking or bursting with personality. There's no flair or identity, there's nothing that really gives you a hint of excitement before you jump in. It's the kind of menu you forget instantly after you leave it, and honestly, that's a pretty accurate preview of this game as a whole. Now, there's actually a surprising amount of content here, at least on paper. In single player, you've got Extreme Off-Road, Beat the Clock, Championship, Quick Race, and Time Trial. On the surface, that's a solid lineup. It actually sounds like a complete package. But you know what kind of series you're watching here. Once you actually start playing, you realise that quantity doesn't necessarily translate into quality. Extreme Off-Road is probably the most interesting mode, at least conceptually. Instead of racing opponents, you're tackling environmental challenges, climbing steep hills, crossing rivers, navigating rough terrain. This is where the idea of Hummer Badlands actually makes sense. These vehicles are supposed to be rugged, capable and unstoppable, but the execution doesn't really live up to that promise, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Beat the Clock and Time Trial are exactly what you'd expect: race against time, optimize your route, repeat. Championship mode is your standard progression system, multiple cups, each consisting of 5 races, with points awarded based on finishing position. One thing worth noting though is that each championship cup is tied to a specific location, with multiple track variations in that area. It's a clever way of stretching limited environments into more content, but it also means on the flip side that things start to feel repetitive very quickly. Oh, and then there's Quick Race, which is, well, Quick Race, you don't need me to explain that to you. So let's get straight to it. This is a racing game where the racing feels completely at odds with the vehicles that you're driving. Hummers are not fast, they're not nimble, and they're not designed for tight corners or high-speed competition. They are literally pretty much tanks. So putting them on traditional racetracks, which are wide, smooth, forgiving, completely removes any sense of challenge or identity. You're not wrestling with terrain so much, or carefully navigating obstacles, you're just driving, and not even in a particularly demanding way. Don't get me wrong, there is some terrain where you're going off-road, but for the most part, it's very easy stuff. And speaking of that, the biggest issue with this game is how unbelievably easy it is. This is one of those games where you can pick it up, play through the majority of the content, and be done basically within a couple of hours. And that's even if you're not skilled at racing games, like me. There's very little resistance or punishment or any need to improve. If this were an actual arcade machine, it probably wouldn't last long financially because you wouldn't need to keep putting in coins. You'd master it within about 5 seconds. There are moments in the extreme off-road mode where you might fail a challenge a couple of times, but even then, that's not because of the mechanics, it's more just because it's not clear where to go. Once you figure out the correct path, that's it. Challenge over. Now, there are only 3 main vehicles in the game. The Hummer H1, the H2, and the H3. Each one represents a slightly different tier, the H1 being the biggest and heaviest, and the H3 being the most streamlined and performance-oriented, if that's a thing of the Hummers. But here's the problem, really they don't feel that different. Yes, there are slight variations in stats. Yes, in certain modes you can tweak things like suspension and tyres and brakes. But in practice, they all handle in almost exactly the same way. So instead of getting that awesome feeling when you unlock a car that you've succeeded, it just feels like you've unlocked some cosmetic variation of a car you've already driven 100 times. And that kills a lot of the motivation to continue or experiment with the game. So let's talk about the handling and the physics, because this is another part where the game really falls apart. The handling in Badlands can be described as floaty. Not in a fun arcadey way though, more like you're driving a balloon. These massive, heavy vehicles bounce around the place like they weigh nothing. You will hit bumps and launch into the air in a way that feels completely disconnected from reality. It honestly feels closer to something like driving on the moon than a grounded off-road experience. And then there's collision. You can slam into trees, barriers, walls, fellow drivers, and instead of any real consequence, you can just bounce back onto the track. There's not really any sense of impact, no real damage. There's a quick visual cue to show you that, but it's just like a cracked windshield or a dented bumper, and it doesn't affect the performance in any way. For vehicles that are supposed to feel powerful and heavy, they come across as strangely weightless and indestructible. Now, to the game's credit, it does feature a decent number of environments, especially for a budget title. You've got locations like Arizona, Peru, and California. Each one comes with multiple track variations, which does help extend the content, but again, the issue is execution. The tracks themselves are incredibly forgiving, wide roads, minimal hazards, and the shortcuts are kind of pointless. There's no sense of discovery, no reward for experimentation, and because the handling is so forgiving, there's very little risk involved in taking them. So let's talk about the AI in this game, because the AI in Hummer Badlands feels less like a group of competitors and more like a system designed to maintain the illusion of competition. No matter how well you perform, the AI will either stick right behind you the entire time or magically reappear right at the end to give you that sense of a close finish. You can drive a near-perfect race, take every corner cleanly and hit the shortcuts, and somehow they're still there. Not overtaking, not really challenging you, just hovering, like an annoying fly. And on the flip side, if you mess up, like flip your vehicle or take a wrong turn, the AI doesn't really capitalize on it in any meaningful way. They don't pull away or punish your mistakes. They just slow down enough to keep things feeling close, and if they do pass you, you will get passed again very quickly. This is classic rubber banding, but implemented in the most obnoxiously noticeable way possible. There is no illusion of skill here, no sense that you're improving or being tested. It's like the game is constantly adjusting itself to make sure you're never too far ahead or too far behind. And that completely removes any tension, because if the performance doesn't matter, then what's the point of even playing? So speaking of the AI keeping up with you, there's another major issue in this game, and that's the complete lack of consequences. In most racing games, if you go off track, hit an obstacle or make a mistake, there's a cost. You lose speed, you lose position, you lose control, or even get a penalty. But here, not really. You can cut corners aggressively and bounce off walls and plow through scenery, and still come out perfectly fine. The game doesn't demand precision, in fact, to be honest, it barely even encourages it. Which means races don't feel like carefully managed runs, they're just complete chaos. And because the AI is always hovering nearby anyway, there's no real penalty for playing badly. So let's talk about how the game actually looks, because for a PlayStation 2 title released in 2006, this is rough. The vehicle models themselves are decent enough, don't get me wrong. The Hummers look recognisable with acceptable levels of detail for the era and budget I'd imagine this game had, but everything around those cars is kind of where it falls apart. The environments are very basic, the textures are low res, they're quite muddy, and they're clearly reused across multiple tracks. Trees, shrubs, fences, they all look like they've been pulled from the same small pool of assets and just dropped into different locations. There's very little variety and very little detail, and very little effort to disguise that. Don't get me wrong, it's not game-breaking, but it really does add to the overall feeling that this is a rushed, low-budget production, and even for the time, this wasn't impressive. There were plenty of PS2 racing games doing far more with the hardware several years beforehand. The audio side of things is also kind of mixed. The engine sounds are actually pretty solid, there's a decent sense of weight and power when you accelerate, and collisions, despite lacking gameplay impact, do at least sound convincing. But then there's the music. It's just a few generic early 2000s rock, just on loop. And we're not talking generic licensed music here, we're talking background music, royalty-free, looped endlessly. And at first it's fine, it kind of fits the tone well enough, but after 15 to maybe 20 minutes, it wears very thin. Tracks repeat frequently, there's not much variety, and nothing really stands out. It just becomes background noise, and not in a good way. More in a you might want to mute this after 10 seconds kind of way. One of my biggest problems with this game is how quickly you run out of reasons to actually keep playing. Because the game is so easy, and because the content lacks any depth, you can see most of what it has to offer in a very short amount of time. Unlocking new vehicles doesn't feel rewarding because they don't meaningfully change how the game plays. Completing championships doesn't feel like an achievement because the difficulty is so low. And revisiting tracks doesn't offer new challenges because the layouts are too similar and too forgiving. There's no real endgame, no high-level mastery to aim for, and no compelling reason to come back once you've finished the basic experience. It's the definition of a one-and-done experience, and even then, it might not hold your attention all the way through. So unsurprisingly, the game did not exactly set the world on fire in terms of its critical response. The PS2 version of this game holds a score of around 48 out of 100 on Metacritic, which feels, about right. Critics at the time pointed out many of the same issues we've discussed, like lack of challenge and repetitive gameplay. There wasn't much praise to balance it out, and at best I think this was seen as a passable budget title, but at worst, completely forgotten. So of course in terms of sales, that meant the game did not make much of an impact either. According to VG charts, the game estimates to have sold about 50,000 copies, which is not great, but also not surprising. So now the time has come to rank Hummer Badlands in our worst racing games tier list, and should I really just call it Hummer Bad, because that's what it is. It's definitely not the worst one we've played, and in terms of PS2 licensed car games, it's also surprisingly not the worst either. However, it's still not great. So for me, the game will be joining the likes of DT Carnage, London Racer, and Noble Racing in the rubbish tier. On paper, this game is a cool idea, it has some cool concepts, it just has some really bad execution. And you Technics have made some alright games, so I'm surprised this went so wrong. So is the game worth playing today? And honestly, it probably isn't. Unless you're specifically interested in obscure racing games or early 2000s budget titles, or I guess Hummers, there's not much here to recommend. There are far better off-road racers on the PS2 and other platforms, and far better arcade racers too. That said, there is a certain novelty to it, and the idea of racing these cars is weird, and that alone might be enough to get a few laughs out of it, but as a game it's very shallow and forgettable. And so that takes us to the end of our look at Hummer Badlands for the PS2, and with it, this week's episode of Worst Racing Games. So let me know in the comments down below. Have you played this game? What do you think of it, and where would you rank this game on the tier list? And as always, if you have any suggestions you want to see added to the wheel, pop that down below as well. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.